If you could break bread with anyone, cook a meal for anyone, and then share it with them, who would it be? And could that one meal help save the planet? That's today's big question, and my guest is Joanne Molinaro, the Korean vegan. Joanne is a runner, an attorney, blogger, podcast host, and the author of the James Beard Award-winning Korean Vegan Cookbook, named one of the best cookbooks of 2021. But you may know her best as the chef and storyteller behind her wildly popular Instagram and TikTok accounts. Joanne, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you. I'm so excited to be here.
Joanne, I like to start with one important question. It's a little bit silly, sure, on the face of it, but also it does tend to set the tone for what we're doing here. And I usually end up getting something thoughtful out of it. So instead of, hey, what's your entire life story, which I'm very aware is like your whole business, I like to ask, Joanne, why are you vital to the survival of the species?
I would say if I had to be bold and honest and accurate, I'm not vital to the survival of the human species. I just am not. I'm only one out of several billion people on this planet. And while I like to believe that I'm doing my part to make the world better than it was the day that I arrived on this planet, I think that, to be honest, there are probably a lot of people who could do what I do and do it even better than what I do. That doesn't, however, excuse me from doing the best that I can do while I am on this planet.
That's fantastic. Thank you. I feel like half our answers are people going, clearly I'm not, but also here's what I'm trying to do. And I love that.
I think that's awesome.
I think that's very important. I'm going to tell you a little bit of a story. So I met my wife long distance. We met at like a Caribbean wedding. She writes romantic comedies. The whole thing was preposterous. I go out. We did long distance for a while. She was in LA. I was in New York. And about a month after we met, and I flew away on a seaplane. I mean, again, just ridiculous. I go out to Los Angeles to surprise her for her birthday. And she's having a big party. She likes to have parties. And they had gotten catering for this little house we ended up living together up in the hills. It was drop-off catering. So everything is great. All Mediterranean food. Amazing. We wake up the next morning after everybody leaves, and there's literally just hummus everywhere. I mean, there's so much food all over the place. And we're like, if we're gonna do this, we're gonna have to do it better next time. And I promise this is going somewhere. The next year, same crew, same house. 2009, we thought, hey, you know what's the new cool thing? Korean barbecue food truck. And so pulls in the driveway. I mean, they're not happy about driving up in the hills, but pulls in the driveway, barely fits. Everybody makes food. It's amazing. It's the hot new thing. Truck leaves. No hummus everywhere. Everybody wins. It's been, oh my God, how long has it been? 12 years, 13 years, Joanne? I don't even know at this point. But in that time, it's two things have happened. You have made this space for yourself during this time, right? You've carved this thing out. But in that period, I feel like, and I was thinking about this a lot this morning because of time and children growing and all this stuff going quickly and political and all that. The last 10 years have been driven by a diminished capacity, it seems like, for empathy among folks. The more we're all connected on all these social things, right, the more it seems like we can be driven apart, and we are driven apart. But also by a Korean barbecue food craze, right? It opened everybody up to Korean food, but I imagine, and correct me if I'm wrong here, please, that it also immediately flattened the cuisine and the culture a little bit, right? Pros and cons a little bit. I want to hope and believe and participate in however I can in this idea that there's the opportunity for a deeper understanding of food as a cultural experience, as an empathy device. And I wonder how all of these things since then, after everything you've done, if you think that that is true, if it can be true, and what we can do to improve on that mechanism and to lean on it as much as we can. Does any of that make any sense at all? You can say no and hang up.
No, okay, I'm going to hang up. No. I think so much of that makes sense. And what I love about the way that you described it is that some of them are contradictory, right? And the idea, of course, is that we're complex human beings. We live in a very complex world where there can be a lot of contradictions that continue to coexist and create tension, even at our own dining table. And there's opportunity in that sort of tension. There's opportunity for continued division and tribalism and lack of empathy, as you say, but there's also opportunity for overcoming that to arrive at something that's far more beautiful and profound and compassionate.
I love that. And it's a little bit like the lighthouse in the storm. right? Because all we hear is everyone's on Facebook arguing with each other, or Instagram and body issues and this. And occasionally you hear like the one positive thing that might be coming out of these things, right? The Facebook group that raised a bunch of money for X, or the, the Instagram person who's come along and explored food or transgender rights or whatever it might have been, any of these type of things. And I feel like one gets so much more play than the other. And sometimes that's important because it might, for instance, break democracy, right?
Yeah.
Not so great
Yeah.
in this country or any other. But at the same time, and we try to here to back it up. When people subscribe to our newsletter, they get a little confirmation email from me. Hey, here's what to expect, yada, yada. And then there's one question, and it's, why are you here? And I get just the most incredible 2 words like, I believe in science, or want to help, or it's, I'm a 7th grade science teacher and here's all my things, or I'm a grandparent in this, or I'm an immigrant, or I lost 3 cousins to COVID, whatever it might have been. And that is so empowering, and it's important because it's all people going, what can I do? How can I help? And so it's hard sometimes to not look at Facebook broke everything, or this, or, TikTok is possibly just harvesting your data for that. It's so important to focus on folks like yourself who are trying every day to carve out that place. Like you said, there's always probably going to be some tribalism at the dinner table, right? Among everything else.
I think that one takeaway that I've had from a podcast that I've listened to a lot, just the Ritual podcast, and there was
Love Rich.
one, I adore him, and he had a guest, and I can't remember who it was, but this stuck out to me, and because it's applicable to my business, it's applicable to what I do every day, and it's also just applicable personally, which is, the human brain has evolved to respond 13 times more to danger and negativity than it is to something that makes them feel good or positive. And that sort of makes sense, right? It's the flight or fight syndrome. Our bodies necessarily get into fight mode when we feel danger or risk. So that when we see something on the internet that makes us angry, like we see somebody, getting beaten up by cops, or if we see, somebody dressed up like Hitler walk into a bar in Soho, or, something like that, then we're so much more likely to click on that. We're so much more likely to comment on that, and we're so much more likely to share that than if you see, a woman making pindeto talking about, let's be nice to each other. Oh, that's nice.
Sure.
But we're less likely to engage with that kind of content. And in a world that's incentivized by clicks, views, and likes, right? That's how big businesses make money, through ad revenue and through engagement. When that sort of incentive is in place, like worldwide, across the world, because of the internet and the business model that supports that infrastructure, then necessarily what's going to happen is that people are going to be incentivized to create more negativity, to create more division, more tribalism, less empathy, less compassion, because those 2 things, empathy and compassion, are viewed as weak ways of operating in a world that's, pretty much built on cruelty and indifference. So we don't have time for empathy. We don't have time for compassion. We have to deal with the fires that are, all over the world. And I think that's kind of where we are. The reason that food can be such a powerful tool against that is because everyone needs to eat. Right? There isn't a single human being who can be like, yeah, no, I'm just not going to eat. Okay. Everyone needs to eat. And therefore, it's automatically something that we can relate to and something that we all have vulnerability to. And then, of course, the act of breaking bread with someone, something that you and your wife are probably very familiar because you're having these weekly sort of dinner parties, is one of the most vulnerable things that you actually can do with a person, because you're putting something into your body in front of another person. And that automatically creates this sort of disarmament that happens at your dining table, at a party, or wherever you are breaking bread with one another. And so these things that happen just by virtue of sharing a meal with a person, cooking a meal for a person, can already help to dismantle that sort of negative seeking propensity that we have built by virtue of this strange sort of internet economy that we've created.
Let me ask you this. If Thank you for such an incredibly thoughtful response. Again, I feel like we're just done here. That sums it all up. There's this, sort of thought in virology and epidemiology, which was, we're very lucky that this has happened before, this pandemic that we're still going through and will undoubtedly happen again for a number of reasons. And maybe we'll be better prepared for it. But the point is, very lucky that in 2020 we had so many tools to immediately address it, right? We got rid of so much red tape for dealing with building vaccine trials, right? The stories are incredible. Within 48 hours, places, the genome of the virus had been scanned and downloaded and was in labs across the world. Like, that's incredible. And you were able to take what was a pretty popular blog and Instagram and things like that and go, well, shit, now I'll try video. Mm-hmm. What might your mechanism have been 10 years ago if video didn't exist? How could you have tried to carve out a similar space without that particular tool? I mean, Tumblr, I don't know. I'm curious.
Well, I did have a Tumblr, actually, and that was my first foray into my internet persona. So it was, I would have said Tumblr if you hadn't said it yourself. I had a Tumblr. I wrote a lot, and everything is a continuum. There's no such thing as like one day I woke up and became a TikTok star. Like, that doesn't exist. Right. There's always a step that led to that step that led, to the step that you're going to take. Right. And I would say that the genesis of my creative side, if you will, because remember, I am still a practicing attorney, but I was a full-time practicing attorney for the past, 17 years. So at that time in 2010, I think, was when I started a Tumblr account. I was working full-time as, I would say, mid-level associate. So I was really working hard.
Yeah. I mean, there's full-time and then there's full-time associate at a law firm is no joke.
It was a really tough time, but that's probably one of the reasons I was excited to do something so different, which was to pursue something that used a different part of my brain, right? I was trying to be creative and exercise, parts of me that had remained rather dormant for many, many, many years. And those came in the form of photography. I wanted to learn how to take better pictures with my new camera. I mean, I had a nice job that afforded me the ability to buy lots of nice things for my hobby, but I wanted to learn how to use them. So I started a Tumblr to share my photography. I was taking pictures of, the lion in front of the Art Institute in Chicago, the Sears Tower. It was just so hackneyed. And then I started writing poetry because I fell into a group on Tumblr called like the Writers of Tumblr or something like that. And
awesome.
And I started writing poems. And that's probably what I would have continued doing, is carving out a little space for myself where I was writing a lot and also taking photographs. I never thought in a million years it would turn to food, because I didn't see food as a there was no urgency around it. It wasn't until I became plant-based in 2016 when I was like, oh, wow, no, there's an urgency here now, because now I feel like my identity is at risk. But before that, if I want food, I can order out, I can cook something, my mom will make something for me, I could go to a restaurant. There was an abundance of the kind of food that I like to eat. It wasn't until the prospect of that being removed from my life that then I turned to, well, what am I going to do about this?
I love that. And I know you've shared this a bit before, sort of, however many times in the 7,000 interviews you've done. But correct me if I'm wrong here. You didn't actually cook too much, is that right? Before you were sort of, your then boyfriend was like, I'm going to go vegan. And you were just like, fuck you, man. And you had to sort of veganizing. By the way, my wife can have a very long conversation with you about the entire exact experience she went through. And she was just like, Jesus, this guy, like, oh, God. Because I feel like I'll talk to, again, I've had almost 150 of these incredible conversations, and, it's someone going, well, I grew up and my aunt was blind, and so I decided to work on blindness, or I grew up in a place that has already been hit by sea level rise. And so it's both like you're asking why I work on this, why I have to do this, because I have to, but also because that's my people and because I have this lived experience that all these other people don't. And so I know the best way to address this for the sense of place, but also the people. You felt like your food and your culture were going to be threatened for you, but at the same time, you weren't just like, I've been making pork my entire life. Not as much, right?
That's pretty much sums it up. I did feel like my culture was being threatened. And that was because my boyfriend and now my husband, Anthony, is white. And so he had almost no understanding of my cuisine, of Korean cuisine. He'd tried very, very little of it up until that point. He didn't really show much interest in it either, which I think was a big problem for me. We were new in our relationship, and I've written about and talked about a lot of the unique challenges that face interracial relationships, and we've definitely come a long way. But at that point, I was like, who are you to demand this of me? Like, you don't even know what you're asking me to give up. And of course, for many immigrant families, food is incredibly important to their cultural identity because it's one of the few things that they're able to continue doing as an homage to the places that they've left. And in my case, my parents are from North Korea, so that there's no possibility of them ever going back to the places they were born, right? And so food is one of literally the few things they have left of the homes that they can never return to. So to take that away from somebody is threatening. Now, obviously, I'm not from North Korea. I was born and raised in Chicago, Illinois. I had my fair share of spaghetti and, McDonald's and all of those things growing up. But still, the notion that a white guy was asking me so blithely to give up the things from my childhood, it rubbed me the wrong way. But at the same time, like you said, I wasn't so far along that I was going to be like, never, like I will never give up pork or I will never give up kalbi and things like that. I think one of the reasons, in retrospect, is because I love animals so much. I've always loved animals. And there was a small part of me that said, well, I am a little different in that I know that like my love of animals is very, very powerful. And perhaps that this is an opportunity for me to live a life that's a bit more consistent with my values. And then, of course, I watched Cowspiracy, and I was like, oh, now it's not just for the animal. Like, there's so many reasons to do this.
Yeah, it's tough to watch. I always try to, as my wife has kindly put it many times in the past, I have the unique ability to be the bummer in any conversation. Pick a topic. It's people, and here it's incredible. It's fall. It's everyone outside. They're like, yeah, it's pretty warm today. I'm like, don't say it. They're having a nice time. Don't ruin this for them. But it's the same thing with, so when I want to talk about, or when someone asks something about climate, or very early on in COVID and talking to epidemiologists and scientists about these things, I do like to preface people and say, on a scale of 1 to 10, like how much of this conversation do you really want to have? Because it can be difficult, and watching those documentaries can be the same thing. There's really no way to unsee some of those things, which is the point. But it obviously can be very triggering. But if you're also a little bit on the way, like you said, you loved animals, but hey, maybe this could be a little more intentional, those can really set you on that path.
I think that's a really good way of putting it. I think I was open to the idea, like even 1% open, but that's all it takes. I say that about so many things that I do now with my current career, which is my job is to open the door by like 1%, because that's all it takes for me to get a toe in. And once I get my toe in the door, then I can be very strategic about, just wedging it open a little bit more and a little bit more, a little bit more, until I get my whole body through and we're having a conversation. That's really all I want to do. And I think that you're exactly right. When I saw Cowspiracy, like there was already like a little bit of a toe in that door. And then when I watched it, it just kind of flew open. And I was like, well, now I really have no excuse. Like I just need to figure out a way to make this work.
It's interesting. So I went, and we can either talk about this a little bit or have an entire offline conversation about this. But when I did my first marathon, I was in fine shape, but I was like, I'm going to get old at some point. Let's maybe run with a little less meat on our bones, shall we? And so I decided to drop. I mean, this was, again, 2010, 11? I don't know. So time means nothing. I decided to drop meat and dairy. My wife has a great story of like 3 days later coming home and I'm just like tearing apart a rotisserie chicken because I had just like planned wrong, basically. Like I hadn't thought about like where I was going to get my food that day. And even in Los Angeles in 2010, like not a lot of options, you know, to do it right. And I was trying to really stick to it and I just fucked it up. And she was just like, Jesus, it looks like a T-Rex in here, right? But that was truly like my only reason. Oh, and I had just read, I guess that's wrong. I'm 100% like blocking out pain here, which I'm sure you're familiar with. One of my best friends had just died from cancer. So I was in still like a bit of a depression for sure. Little drinky on the bottle. And I had just read controversial book now. It is what it is. The China study. And essentially they were like, if you eat meat, you're going to die. And that's the sum of like the 700 pages or whatever. And I was in a place of, oh, then I guess I have to like rewrite my whole life. Because he got this cancer that is usually like 70-year-old people who smoke all their life. And he was not that. He's 29 years old. So I thought, I got to go as healthy as I can. So drop meat, drop dairy. The point is, it was like to run a marathon. It wasn't because of animals. It wasn't because of this and that. But now, however many 13 years later, and especially with kids who ask questions like, hey, Dad, is the chicken we eat different from the chicken, the animal? And you're like, the next 10 seconds aren't going to be great for you. It's interesting how much more intentional I try to be for myself and how much more of a factor that plays. But not unexpectedly, but like you said, it was kind of like, oh, I guess I've always given a shit about animals. And now I'm driving around like, what are we doing?
It's amazing. That was what I call one of the unexpected byproducts of going plant-based. And I try to use the word plant-based intentionally only to make it clear that my original decision to go or remove animal products wasn't an ethical one, at least not in the way that's traditionally described. I went plant-based largely for the environment and for my own health. That was kind of it. My father was diagnosed with prostate cancer right around that time when I was kind of like ruminating, like, do I do this permanently or not? And that had a large, like, compulsion to me. Like I was like, oh, now I am compelled to remove meat. Sure. Like this, my dad getting cancer, like literally while I'm thinking about these studies, probably the same ones that, you know, were in the China study. I was like, this is a sign, for health, I have to be a good role model for my father. And then also, like I said, Cowspiracy had such an enormous impact on kind of my view of my job as a human. Like I can't leave this place more horrible than it was when I walked into it. That's my, just kind of like, I always say, like when you go and stay over at someone's house, you never want to leave that guest bedroom looking worse than when you walked into it. That is your job as a guest. And that's kind of the same way I view this planet. I'm a guest on this planet. My job is to leave it looking even a little bit better than it did when I walked in. So, but what it did was, like I said, I'd always had this love of animals. And as soon as I eliminated animals from my dinner plate, all of a sudden I was able to allow that part of my heart to just swell in this really amazing way. And I just embraced it because now I could do it without sort of these hangups of cognitive dissonance. Like I didn't have to have that conversation with myself. What is the difference between the chicken on my plate and the chicken at the zoo? None, I didn't have to have that really difficult conversation with myself anymore. And that was just the most liberating feeling ever. And I just dove into it. I was like, I can do this now. And that's when we began the process of, obviously eliminating animal products from everything, not just our food.
I love that. And same sort of like Grinch style. My heart has swelled. And now I'm the dad who, we're driving along and I'm like, let's stop for 5 minutes and look at the family of deer. And what do you think? And their kids are like, we're late for swim practice. Can we please get going? And I'm like, yes, however.
This is important.
But it is such a release, isn't it? It's incredible to just be like, oh, I mean, it's a little bit of like, again, it's the most ridiculous version of this, but like letting your flag fly a little bit. We were just like, everything is beautiful and incredible. Like what? Why not? Why not? And again, I understand, eating meat was an important part of our evolution. And I understand what an important part of so many cultures it can be and things like that. But at the same time, And I loved this part of your conversation with Rich Roll. I'm a huge fan of his, again, as a runner and as someone who struggled to go vegan. He's been doing the podcasting for so long. I mean, truly ancient. I loved the part of the conversation where you guys were talking about your experience talking with the folks, the Buddhists who have been eating this way for so long, right? Where a label like vegan is quite literally means nothing to them, right? It's part of the values. And my longtime listeners, those poor people, understand that I am two things. I am a religious studies major and also a pagan atheist monster, right? I just
makes total sense.
I love it. And, yeah, right, exactly. But one of the things I feel like I really cherish, because I think it helped kickstart a little bit my empathy machine, was understanding that for so many cultures and peoples around the world who can't even be defined by one culture, much less like nation-state borders that didn't exist 50 years ago, which is half the world. This idea of religion, right, is very Western. You go on Sunday, like that's a thing, like this institutionalized thing, where for most folks, your faith, your spirituality is just a part of the everyday way that you make your home, your relationships, the food you eat, right? The way you honor your dead or bury them if you do. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit, and people can just listen to Rich Roll convo with you if they like, about all those concerns you had about like losing your identity and your culture, what it was like to then connect with them and find out there's a part of it that's actually very different. Like, did that give you comfort and confidence?
I think one of the things that you said at the very outset of this conversation was how, with the popularity of Korean barbecue and Korean cuisine, also comes with the attendant inevitability of flattening and two-dimensionalizing that cuisine. And that is absolutely a drawback anytime you have sort of mass proliferation of cultural aspects, right? And we see that a lot nowadays, even with Korean dramas and Korean pop culture, BTS, and certainly with Korean food. And the interesting thing about that, of course, is the diasporic aspect of that. How much of that flattening is actually happening at the hands of Korean diaspora, i.e., in our case, Korean Americans, right? As a Korean American, I grew up thinking that Korean barbecue was pretty much, Korean food. Like, that's it, Korean barbecue, and I thought we were a very meat-centric culture. Of course, it completely ignored the fact that for most of my childhood, we were eating mostly vegetables because my parents are refugees, so they still believed that meat is something you only have, on very rare, special occasions, and also because, my family were farmers. That's what they traded on, was vegetables. So we always had a wide array of beautiful vegetables from our backyard, which my grandmother tended because that's what she did. She was a farmer. So even though I had this rich lived experience of surviving on mostly plants, I completely ignored it and agreed with everyone else that Korean barbecue was and is the only real major understandable form of Korean food. So when I went to Korea in 2019, and I was given the opportunity to meet with Jeongwan S님, she is a Buddhist monk, Korean Buddhist monk in Korea, and she has been featured in the New York Times. She is a good friend of Eric Ripert, who is a very famous chef in the United States, and written about as one of the most exquisite cooks in all the world. And I found out that she was plant-based and vegan, if you can call it that, vegan. I was like, oh, wow, she's the OG Korean vegan. I got to meet with her, right? And so I had this chance to meet with her in 2019. And I remember being so proud of my Instagram account. And I was like, Sunnim, look at my Instagram account. I call myself the Korean vegan. And I remember she had this sort of like, I'm trying not to roll my eyes look. She was so polite, but she was trying really hard. And then later, as we were saying our goodbyes, she grabs my wrist and I remember she said, vegan, not vegan. What does that even really mean? And she wasn't doing it in a derisive way. She was doing it in a way that she wanted to plant something like in my heart to leave with, And she said, we've been eating this way for over 1,000 years. It's not about some label that people use to describe themselves. This is just how we are. Why do I act like, why do I eat like this? Because I don't want to harm anything. She said, my whole life's purpose is to try and do the least amount of harm. And I remember she showed me, she said, when you pull something out of the ground, you're doing a little bit of hurt to the earth. But that's the least amount that I can do in order to sustain my own life. And then she said something that was so beautiful. She said, anytime you hurt something, you're hurting yourself. So when you hurt a person, you're doing so much damage to yourself. When you hurt an animal, you're hurting so much yourself. The least amount of harm you can do is to pull a little shoot out of the ground, a root out of the soil. And even then, make sure don't do any chemicals, don't, make sure to do it as naturally as possible. And to your question, yeah, that comforted me a lot because I was so much about policing who I was, what I was, whether I was Korean enough, whether I was vegan enough, whether I was this enough. And for her to describe it in such a beautiful way was, again, liberating to me because it allowed me to create sort of my own boundaries of what it meant to be the least harmful person I could be.
I love that. It's so much more intentional, but it also just becomes so much more inescapable for us, right? It's a little bit like taking the red pill where you just look around and go like, what have I been doing? And not in a way that makes us feel terrible about ourselves, but in a way that's just going, we always, the whole when's the best time to plant a tree? Yesterday, today, right? We always have this opportunity to become more intentional every day. Right? Just because this is the way you've always done things. It's the sunk cost fallacy, right? Doesn't mean we can't move forward. When you were talking about this idea of like the most hurt I can do, or the least hurt I can do is to pull out the shoot and be thankful for it and eat it. It reminds me of this wonderful quote that I'm going to butcher from Robin Wall Zimmerer. I'm not sure if you're familiar with her. She's a fantastic indigenous author. It's this idea of sort of never take the first plant you see so that you know you're never taking the last one, right? Which is, again, that's not complicated. It's not hard. And I know it can seem, I guess, foo-foo to some folks, but it actually matters. I mean, literally this morning, the new president of Brazil is getting sworn in, and it's all on the line because it's just like we can't just keep taking. And that really matters. I really appreciate you sharing that. Thank you. That just stuck out to me so much in the conversations because there's nothing like being, and again, you said she didn't say it in a derivative way, but there's nothing like sort of being scolded by history, going like, you kind of have it all wrong. It's so much more beautiful and complex like that. And it's okay. And you can turn it around. And then she leaves you with that thinking thing as you're getting on the plane.
Great. It was really amazing for her to leave me with that thought.
So I would love, because we talked about it a little bit, from my perspective, and you were saying what a moment in your life it was when you started to switch over and how your dad was sick and your boyfriend was being very annoying because that's what we do. I would love to talk a little bit about, because again, I want to keep coming back to what people seem to appreciate and take so much from, besides the food, which is great. It's really great. All I do is cook from it. It's fantastic. Besides the food is you have built, again, sort of like the beginning of our conversation, a place that is so intentionally vulnerable for people. You have done that by modeling it, by talking about your marriage history, by talking about your family and their immigration story and your struggles with their relationships, but also about running and body dysmorphia and body issues. So from my side, I went from a ridiculously vain two-sport college athlete. I mean, I was a swimmer. I spent my entire life in spandex, right? To heavy desk job, just sloth, eating chicken parm at 11 p.m., 14 inches long when I got off, to frappuccinos at 7 a.m., coffee, not so much. And then this moment where I was fully depressed from the death of a friend and moving and new life and drinking to going, maybe I'll run a marathon. I used to be an athlete, and my body being like, whoo, let's be a little careful with how we're doing that. Struggling to plan around it, right? Eventually being marginally more intentional about what I eat and when I eat, why I eat, where I eat, but literally how I eat, right? So I have ridiculous reflux, literally chewing my food, right? Being patient. It's fine, please. People have 1,000 times more. But the point is, it all sort of plays together. Why is it so important to build this place in the beginning of this pandemic where you especially, and then hopefully other people behind you, and they have, can be so vulnerable. And why do we need that so much? I mean, we talked about it a little bit, but like, why do we need this so much?
It's largely to address the fallacy that became reinforced during the pandemic, that we are alone and that the universe doesn't care. I have been working through a lot of these issues myself, intentionally in a public way, through now my podcast and the videos that I do. And what I think I've come away with understanding is the immense despair that comes with this, again, lie that the universe doesn't care, that we are indifferent. And I think many of us felt that very keenly during the pandemic because we had so little control over this disease that on every single score was giving no quarter. It was killing people, thousands and thousands of people every single day, requiring us to remove ourselves from the pillars of love, security, safety, and that was our family, right? And so I think the reason that the messaging that I had created on the Korean Vegan was so received during the pandemic was because there was a hole there that required filling. The stories that I shared, though, the vulnerability, that had been something I'd been doing for many, many years. And that started in 2017. And that was directly a result of the 2016 election here in the United States. And it was in the same way, like I created the Korean Vegan in the beginning because I needed vegan Korean food. I was like, there's nobody else doing it. There's a problem. Right. I need to solve it. So I guess that's just, right. I got to do it. So that's why I started it. And then in 2017, after the election, I was like, all right, like nobody else is talking about what it's like being an immigrant family in a non like angry, attacky way. So I'm just going to do it because that's always been my style. You know, I'm a trial lawyer. My whole job is about advocacy and persuasion. And, you know, there are some who do it really well by bullying you and by just drumming it and drilling it into you and making you feel like a total idiot unless you agree with them. That's a style. And sometimes that works. That's not my style. It's never been effective for me because I just don't believe it. And so my style has always been, let's find some common ground. What can we agree about first? And then let's work on the things that maybe we don't agree on. And that was what I wanted to do, was to build that foundation of common ground by sharing stories. And the only way to do that is by being vulnerable. I know you have felt loss. I know you have been hurt before. I know you understand what heartbreak is. And I do too. So let's start there. And from there, we can build on things that may be a little bit more complicated, a little bit harder. We can talk about our differences. We can talk about the things that we haven't lived through together. But from that common ground, we can elicit compassion and empathy. So that sort of habit of vulnerability was something that I had developed. It was just now done through video during the pandemic, which of course automatically added another layer of vulnerability.
I was grabbing a sandwich for lunch at 3 o'clock the other day. My whole goal these days is eat before the clock turns to 3 o'clock. It's not going great. Anyways, I'm next door the other day and they're just like, technically lunchtime's over, but yes, we will make you another veggie sandwich. I'm talking to my buddy, mentioning something about my wife, who's the most incredible human on the face of the planet, and her writing. And this gentleman steps up. We're in a fairly touristy area here, Colonial Williamsburg, so no idea where he's from, what his story is. And he says, hey, listen, I couldn't not step over and say, you said something about a writing career. I have 100 poems I wrote and I work in construction. How do I publish them? And my heart was just like, psh, because to write poems for yourself takes, especially as a typical dude, and don't want to judge him or identify him in any other way, but just the way we usually are, especially in this society, which is a big part of the problem, which is like, you don't do that. To do that for yourself is such a leap, right? To walk over to a stranger and say, hey, listen, here's my deepest secret. I got 100 of these things. I want to share them with people is a huge leap. And I was like, one, publishing is a nightmare. Two, there's all these incredible services that can make them a book you can share with your family, and you can also self-publish and Amazon, all this different stuff, right? Again, we have the tools that we've never really had before to do these sort of things, but also just like, go get them, man. Like that's incredible. And I feel like you have, again, carved this space where, like you said, we were so impotent at the beginning of this thing. And physiologically so, right? This was a relatively unique, novel thing. None of us had thing. And so the only answer was like, you have to separate from each other for as long as we can, even though that's the things that tie us together. And that's very difficult. And yet it is, I mean, almost inarguably, at least for our generation, the most common experience any of us have ever had and will ever have. And so a space like yours is, like you said, you can look people in the eye for the first time, really, and say, I know you have experienced something like this because we're all doing it right now. So let's talk about that, and then we can move on to more complex things. And that just matters. And all I can think about is, these moments of how we haven't really, so many people forever couldn't mourn, they couldn't go to the hospital even, or now they couldn't have a funeral, or now we just keep racing ahead. How do we come back to this common denominator, right? And a place like yours, or there's this wonderful Twitter feed, now an app and a website called Goodable, which I think you would love. It's fantastic, run by this Canadian war journalist who's just like, I'm just going to put good out every day. And it's fantastic. Just to come back to these things matters so much because we can't build something better and more equitable and more just for everyone unless we take these huge, terrifying things and say, we were all here. Let's go from there.
Yeah, I mean, that raises such a interesting quandary, like this Goodable that you talk about. I always wonder, is it a function of packaging or is it more than that? How do we inspire people to be more intentional? Because however easy it is to say, let's make the world a better place, the truth of it is, it's hard. It's hard. It's not easy to make the world a better place. It's simply not easy to make this world a little bit prettier than it was than when you arrived on it. It takes work. It really does. And there's so many people who are like, dude, do you know how much work it takes for me to just roll out of bed every day? And by this, I mean 100%. Literally, it can be physically difficult for people to just get out of bed, to pay their, mortgage or their rent, to get food on the table for their, kids. These are things that, these exigencies that kind of crop up for people. These are just their lived daily lives, right? So sure. The notion of something as lofty as make the world a better place, honey, I'm just trying to pay the rent, Yeah. So it's hard, and it's really, you have to be super intentional about it. So when you hear about large places like Goodables or some other kind of internet presence that's really just about creating a safe, warm, positive space that reminds us all that the world can be good and therefore it is not hopeless. Again, sometimes I'm like, okay, how do we package that so that it reaches as many people as possible, that it truly inspires as many people as possible to be a little bit more intentional, to say, hey, keep fighting that good fight. Your hard work is not in vain. And sometimes I think sometimes comedy is a really good way of packaging this, because we see now comedy videos on TikTok doing so well. Is it dance? Hey, I'm all about it. If dance is what's going to get out there, a really funny dancing video, fine, do it. So, but again, I'm always stymied by that human instinct to react more to the things that frighten us, that do fill us with despair, that do fill us with rage and anger, than we are the things that make us smile and the things that make us happy. And so the challenge remains, all right, maybe we just need to package this a little bit differently so that the messaging still gets across.
I think the marketing matters, right? It sounds so ridiculous, but you made a s'mores video about one of the hardest stories a human could experience or tell, no matter how many, or even listen to, no matter how many times removed. Sitting there telling my parents eating dinner with my kids last night, and I was like, oh, and this and that, and I can't wait, and they've eaten the food and all this. I was like, I got to tell you this. The one of them, literally, this is 60 seconds, and they were like, Jesus. But the marketing matters. And clearly you understand that, like how we package these things, matters because everyone's like, why is she making a s'more? And then the chocolate matters.
The interesting thing about that is I actually created that video for a bunch of Fortune 100 companies that were sitting in a boot camp on how to create better TikToks. And so that was, I literally created, because I was like, all right, you want to know how to do good storytelling in order
let's do
to,
this.
if you want to sell your cars more, if you want to sell your makeup better. I mean, these are very recognizable names that I can't say for confidentiality reasons. I was like, I'll show you. I'm going to tell you one of the most difficult stories of my family's genesis, their origin story, and I'm going to do it while breaking apart a s'mores. There's so much thought that goes into reeling people in when you only get them for a second or two before they swipe up to that next story. And so, you're right. Marketing matters, packaging matters, delivery, presentation, all of that needs to be thoughtful if you're going to emerge from the morass, which is so loud and overwhelming.
I try to acknowledge for folks. So we've got this newsletter that's like, hey, here's all the big shit that happened this week. Or at least, most of these things aren't breaking news. They're like, this is the latest on deforestation or food or water or COVID or whatever it might be. But more specifically, here's what you can do about it. And so we've tried over time through this sort of process, put every one of these action steps, as we call them, through this pretty specific ringer of, is it actually going to move the needle? Is it measurable? If it's a piece of legislation, does it actually have a shot? If it's a candidate, do they have a shot? Are they going to do the things they say they're going to do? If it's a charitable organization or an NGO, do they spend their money wisely? Is this a lot of these things are arguable, but is it arguably one of the most effective way to address this problem, whatever it might be? If it's organizing, et cetera, you get the point. Because, like you said, especially now, for so many folks, it is just fucking hard to get out of bed. And so my goal is to say, here's what happened. Here's 2 lines on how to think about it. And if you smash your finger against this button, in a couple clicks, you can do something that at the very least helps you feel a little bit better. And at the same time, it'll also contribute to this greater systemic thing. And I know it might not seem that way some days, but it can. And I just want to give people that little opportunity to be like, look, you did something today, and now you can roll back in bed because I get it. And the more we start with that understanding, I feel like the more effective as a whole as we can be is just recognizing the trauma, right? But also the good intentions. Again, people sign up for this thing. No one willingly reads about climate change. Jesus, like what a nightmare. But they do sign up because we have these big, bold letters and it's ridiculous. And it says science for people who give a shit. And that there's so many more people that give a shit for so many reasons than ever before, because some of the technology behind what we're doing to solve climate change is incredible. Maybe you're a founder or a scientist or someone who's inventing the new Just Egg, right? You're welcome. Or, whatever it might be. Or it's someone who's a doctor who's like, I have to quit. I've been doing this for 3 years and I can't do it anymore. They come here for different reasons, but at the same time, they do give a shit. And what do they want to do? And people are coming to you going like, I have pain. I love food. What is she going to share with me today that's going to help me feel like I can nourish myself, whether through food or something else, but also in a greater way? Because food is the social network, right? That's it.
I love what you just described, because I think that, as creators, podcasters, writers, however you want to describe what you and I do, sometimes there is this temptation to think that we're injecting ourselves into this abyss, that nothing else comes back. But I think what you said is that there are a lot of people who give a shit right now, that even if they feel like they're flailing around, not actually, directing their energy at something useful, the fact that they care enough to want to know, hey, like, what can I do? Like, just tell me what to do. Like, and I love that, like when I first started going plant-based, I was like, no, I don't need a 50 item list of things I can do. Can you pare it down to 5? Like, what are the top 5 things I can do to actually make a difference on climate change? If you give me 50, I won't do any of them. But maybe if you just give me 5, like I can, knock off 3 and feel good about myself, like feel like, oh, I'm making a difference here, And I think that sort of instinct is one that needs to be leveraged in a really smart and strategic way in order to create long-lasting change.
Yeah, and it seems, I guess, subjectively, objectively, however you want to measure it, it can seem ridiculous to say, like, buy the cookbook and start eating this way, and you're going to help climate change. People are like, I mean, all right, like easy. But it's true. It's 100% true, right? Addressing the Western diet and building empathy and doing these things is one of the most fundamental pieces we can do, literally, when it comes down to carbon emissions, like 100%. On top of everything else. But it just matters. But at the same time, and I do want to get into this for a minute before we start to get you out of here, because you got 7,000 things to do, which is the point of this question. You're welcome for the segue. You have, again, 7,000 interviews. No one had more jobs and things to do than you for quite a while. So many things. And then you also went for a run. I did a race this weekend, and I probably ran 3 times in the month prior. And my buddy was like, are you going to make it? I'm like, well, we'll find out. The point is, like, it's a lot. And I had this wonderful therapist for a long time who was like, hey, buddy, like, your load and your limit can't be the same thing every day. And that is, again, as someone who's immensely privileged with healthcare, I choose to write a term paper about existential dread every week and tell people how to fix it. And then I've also got 3 kids and, a relationship and all those kind of things. But how have you, and I know you've moved from full partner to counsel, but you're still in it because I assume you still love that in some way. You're writing manifestos against Trump in the Atlantic over the years. Like, how have you made any progress against this sort of, yes, I can be intersectional, I can bring all these people in because of all my different life experiences, but at the same time, like, you can only do so much. Like, how are you managing this? Because I think this is also one of the things where people go like, listen, I give a shit, but either I have to because I live in Florida, my home's gone, or because my family wouldn't get the shots, and even though I did, it didn't matter because that's how herd immunity works. They have to, or they've tried and they're just like, I'm spent. I can't do all these things. Like, how are you managing this, both on a day-to-day basis, but now sort of strategically going forward? Because I think that conversation really matters.
Well, I would say that my management of that continues to evolve, especially as sort of a newly minted business person. I've never owned my own business before, and that's how I view my current career. The Korean Vegan is now my business. It's how I make a living, right? And so I'm continuing to learn what it means to be an effective business owner as well as being a good human being. And I think that what I started to do in the beginning was I would just translate the way that I worked at the firm into the way that I should continue to work as a business owner. So if I was very much used to working between 10 to 12 or billing 10 to 12 hours a day, right? Like, that was a pretty normal day. And so I was like, then I should be working about 10 to 12 hours a day as the Korean Vegan. So, that, and my days are very similar in that way in terms of just blocks. I still block all my time. I don't have to bill anymore, but I still think of my hours in that way. I don't know that I'll ever get away from that. And so I wake up, first thing I do is I go for a run, right? And that's what I did as a practicing attorney. And then as soon as I get back from my run, I bill. Or I should say I work as the Korean Vegan, whether it's, filming a video, writing for the podcast, writing for the book, all of those different things. But I've recently discovered 2 things that I think are really important. It was not sustainable for me. Like you, I was writing a term paper. I love that. I was writing a term paper every single week. And, sometimes it would take me 14 hours to write one podcast episode. And it was like, I can't do this. Like, this is not sustainable, and come up with a video for every single day of the week, and have to write, 100 recipes for my cookbook, and, prep for a marathon or whatever race I'm running. Like, this is just, I can't do this. And I'm going to fall apart soon. And I'm going to start fighting with my husband, and I'm going to be a mean person and not fun to live with. And then the other thing, of course, was, this was surprising to me, my videos weren't doing very well. I wasn't getting as many views. I wasn't getting the kind of engagement that I was used to. And I was like blaming the algorithm and getting angry and upset and hating myself and hating the world. And then I decided I'm going to just go back to maybe 3 videos a week, and be really intentional about those 3. Instead of just churning as many out as I can in order to, please the social media gods. And as soon as I started doing that, all of a sudden my engagement went right back up to where it used to be. And so I think that what we sometimes trick ourselves into thinking is the more we do, the better we do. But the truth is, oftentimes, the more we do, the shittier we do. So it's actually better for us. It's a win-win situation for our health and oftentimes our profit margins. And by profit, I don't mean just monetarily. I mean like all the good things in your life, right? Our margins are actually better when we do a little bit less, but put more of our heart and our thought into it. And so these days, I've actually had to curb this instinct of like, no, I got to be working 12 hours a day. Like, no, you know what? Put in a good 6 hours of really thoughtful, intentional Joanne, and then go outside, enjoy the weather, take a walk, cook without a camera in front of yourself, have a conversation with a friend. And it's been a lot better.
That's great. It's really hard to wrap our mind around being able to do this. I mean, first of all, so many of us don't have the ability to do what we do, which is like, hey, here's my blocks, and I'm going to rearrange them and things like that. They're like, no, I have to be at the office or at least on Zoom with some form of pants on. It's not. I understand that isn't an option, but I think at the same time there still are things you can do to protect yourself, frankly, and that's kind of where we are. Like, right, you can't build something that's healthier, more protective, or more nourishing, unless we started to say like, whoa, maybe I'm feeling pretty run down because of these things. What are things we can change? And I mean, as a parent, the first thing I always tell people is you can't control when your kids wake up, but you can control when you go to bed, and that is like literally just start there. Like it makes such like, I totally get the feeling of like your kids have gone to sleep. Now you get your time and start a movie. And I'm like, my 9-year-old's like, what are you guys doing when you go to bed? I'm like, I'm fucking going to bed. So I need you to turn that light off because nothing exciting is happening here. Like mom and dad, mom's already out of here. Like we're going to bed, pal. Like, because it just matters because I got to wake up to, again, it's people asking for snacks. It's small people asking for snacks 24/7. And then I got to do this. I appreciate you sharing that dialing it back can actually make the work better and then help more people because that's the goal, right? So if we could talk specifically about, besides buy the Korean vegan, it's fantastic. Not the person, buy the cookbook. You can't buy the person. It's fantastic. I can't recommend it enough. Let's talk about specific things. Let's knock out your list here of things that people can do to support your mission, your work, and your style of being a human being in the world, which everybody should be. Go.
I like the thing that always comes to mind is go for a run. Like I feel like, like it's so strange because I used to hate physical activity so much. I hated it. I hated moving. Anything. I would always say like anything that requires movement, I hate. But now it's like I can't start the day without it. And I think that it's a big component to why I am able to face some of the day's challenges with a kind of mental toughness that is sometimes required. So I always say, you don't have to run, but if you can start your day with some type of movement, even if it's 20 minutes of just like, plyometrics, like whatever,
sure. Whatever.
like I think that's so important. And I think it just sets the tone for the remainder of the day. And it makes you feel more confident about what you're able to do. Other than that, like I honestly feel like I don't have a lot of other constants. I'm also like constantly just like, okay, just like, how do I get through like this and that and this and that? I will say time blocking on my calendar, like that's a huge thing for me. Like I did that as a lawyer, so working for an employer, traditional employer, and I do that now working for myself is first of all, I put my number of miles in my calendar. It's a non-negotiable meeting in my calendar. So, and my assistant knows that. You can't move that around. But I also block things like this, our podcast today. I block, okay, after the podcast, I have to shoot a video. After that, I've got to write tomorrow's, socials and things like that. And I think that helps to keep me focused. Because otherwise, what I found myself doing before I started doing that was I'd literally like wander around the house and be like, what am I supposed to be, like, what am I doing now? Like, am I supposed to be doing something? And I think that really helps. And then finally, of course, like I always say, like, try and call your parents like as much as you can. And I'm bad about this. I think about my mom and my dad a lot, obviously, for the work that I do, but I don't talk to them enough. And sometimes I have to really remind myself that our time on this planet is limited. It's very, very precious. And especially if you have people that you love who are older than you, you may not realize how few more opportunities you have to spend time with them. So it's pretty much free to call somebody these days, you know, like just whether you use your FaceTime or whatever you got, you know, get in some time with the people that you love. I don't know if that answers your question.
No, I think it all matters because often the answer isn't about the work, right? It's about how we set ourselves up. And often setting ourselves up means doing these other things that nourish us. Literally just eat breakfast. Right?
Yeah.
If that's your thing. Like if you feel weak in the morning, like start with oatmeal or, you know, there's 1,000 different things you can do, but just like set yourself up a little bit. And that often involves like literally just calling family, right?
Yeah.
It's free. I told my kids the other day, I was like, can I tell you what? In middle school, I used to call a girl in Pennsylvania and it was like $50 every 10 minutes. They were like, what the fuck? What kind of world did you live in? And I was like, I know. And I didn't tell my parents, and so they only found out later. It wasn't great. And they were just like, can you FaceTime grandma on the hologram? I'm like, no, I know. It's, yeah, but it does matter, and it means so much to them, and it means over time it can mean so much to you, and just make it a habit. It's fantastic. Well, I really appreciate that. Last few questions we ask everybody. Joanne, what is the first time in your life when you realized you had the power of change or the power to do something meaningful? And that could be with a squad of people or on your own or something you did with your family, whatever it might be.
I would say that it was when I started the Korean Vegan, which is a little embarrassing to me because, you know, I was in my late 30s at that time. But before then, I really didn't think that I had the agency to create any type of real meaningful change outside of my very small universe, which consisted of my parents, my brother, and my partner. So I really didn't think that I had the ability to impact people's lives until I started the Korean Vegan in 2016. And it started with, oh, look, these people actually like my recipes. And then, of course, it became much more meaningful when people started saying, I relate so much to the stories that you share.
That's awesome. Best time is today, right? Who is someone in your life? I mean, and we haven't even talked about the fact that your dad's basically a celebrity at this point. Who is someone in your life that has positively impacted your work in the past 6 months?
Ooh, in the past 6 months. Oh, gosh. You know, I would say, like, I feel like I've used this crutch many. I don't want to call him a crutch, but I feel like it is now because I keep going back to him, and that's definitely Rich Roll. He continues to inspire me so much because of the type of conversations that he has on his podcasts but more than that, just like his life story, it just is so profoundly impactful to me because it makes me feel like every time I'm second guessing myself, which is a lot, like, you know, pretty much every minute of every day, at least, you know, there's a trailblazer right in front of me who is doing these things that is having such a profound effect on not just me, but millions of people every single day. And so, you know, every time I listen to his podcast or, you know, read another chapter from his book or whatever it is, you know, see something on his Instagram, I do feel like it has a direct impact on the types of things that I think and talk about on my own podcast or on my own Instagram or on my own TikToks. It's
really something else. And again, he's been doing this version of himself and what he makes for so long. It's very easy to come at it. Just like I imagine it's someone, I mean, if they had the sound off on your videos, but they're going to get the point real quick. It's very easy to say like, oh, I don't know his story. I do encourage folks to do that because that's why this whole thing exists.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And that matters, again, because we've all suffered in some way and we've all got some hole to dig out of. And the ways to address that for ourselves and then maybe help some folks along the way are manifold. It's incredible. Or if my friend put it, congratulations, now you write a term paper every week for the rest of your life, which sent me into a bit of a hole. You have no time on your hands, but what is a book you've read this year that's either opened your mind to a topic or idea you hadn't considered before or has actually changed your thinking? Yeah, well, I've definitely been ruminating a lot on James Clear and his book, Atomic Habits. And, you know, there's a reason it's been the #1 New York Times bestseller for I don't know. 400 years. Yeah. Every week I'm like, oh, it's James again. Yeah. And now I follow him on Instagram. And so he's constantly doing these posts that are little excerpts from his book. And I will say, like, his ideas of failure
goal setting and, what my husband calls the moving goalposts in my own life, and applying, not science per se, but certainly the scientific method to understanding human behavior, even if it is on a somewhat anecdotal basis. Like, I think that is very helpful because it's so concrete, and it's also really soothing. Again, as somebody who's a little bit obsessed with avoiding and preventing failure, the notions that, James Clear writes about and how to redefine success so that failure actually becomes almost a critical component of that formula has been really mind-blowing to me. It's something that I'm continuing to think about. I actually quoted him and David Goggins, another person that I really enjoy, following on Instagram and listening to. Again, just because, mental toughness is always something that I aspire to, but the way they describe it in a way that's much more accessible than I think people realize is really important.
I love that. And you're not the first guest to have brought up David Goggins, and I'm aware, and I can tell you my association there later. But again, it's easy to look at David's most recent Instagram videos and just be like, look at this person who's shaped like a perfect person is shaped, basically, because they've carved themselves that way, and not understand his story, which, holy shit. Yeah. I mean, talk about mental toughness, but again, overcoming something that's near impossible.
Yep.
And that really does matter. And I appreciate you mentioning moving goalposts and all things like that, because we're all dealing with it every day, right? It's just never good enough, but it is, and it can be. You just set yourself up for that and understand that failure is important. Again, something I try to impart to my children every day. Joanne, this has been fantastic. Where can people find all of your things?
It's very easy. I go by the Korean Vegan basically everywhere. So you can find the Korean Vegan on, Spotify and iTunes, like all the podcasting places. You can find the Korean Vegan on the internet at thekoreanvegan.com. And then, of course, all of my social media handles on Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, Twitter are at the Korean Vegan. So I make it very easy.
Well done. Thank you so much for this time, which you'll never get back, and for all that you do. I really, really appreciate it. You have nourished my family and I and our friends, and we're going to keep passing that on. And the space you have very purposefully and worked hard and been through a lot to carve out is very meaningful and helpful to a lot of folks. So thank you.
Well, thank you very much. It was such a pleasure chatting with you this morning.